Welcome, everybody. My name is Kemi Jonah. It is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker today. I am Assistant Vice Chancellor for Digital Innovation at Northeastern University out of Boston. And it is my great honor today to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Vic McCrary. I have to say, in preparing to give this intro, it is truly rare these days to meet someone who is more dedicated to serving his hometown region than Dr. McCrary is. He was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and completed his undergraduate degree in chemistry from the Catholic University of America. After completing his PhD in physical chemistry in 1985 from Howard University, he then began his career at AT&T Bell Labs, where he conducted research on crystal growth for semiconductor lasers. Later, he served as the Chief of Convergent Information Systems Division at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST as we know it. And while there, Dr. McCrary headed the research and development program, as well as the development of technical standards in areas such as biometrics, digital preservation, DVD reliability, digital TV, quantum communications, and electronic books. Dr. McCrary then returned to academia, joining Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory. And then he became the first vice president for research and economic development at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland's largest HBCU. Later, he did a brief stint as the vice chancellor for research at the University of Tennessee, before returning to his longtime home base in the Washington, D.C. area. Today, Dr. McCrary serves as the Vice President for Research and Graduate Programs at the University of the District of Columbia, which, for those who don't know, is an HBCU and the only public university in Washington, D.C. Dr. McCrary has such a long list of awards and honors that I would probably use up all of his speaking time if I were to run through all of them. So let me just mention a couple in order to recognize his many achievements. In 2002, Dr. McCrary received the Percy Julian Award for Lifetime Achievement in Research in Science and Engineering by the National Organization for the Professional Advancement of Black Chemists and Chemical Engineers. And then in 2015, he received the Alumni Award for Research Excellence from the Catholic University of America and the Distinguished Alumni Award by Howard University in 2017. A couple of things that really struck me as particularly interesting about Dr. McCrary's illustrious career is that he organized the world's first conference on electronic books in 1998 and was part of the research group that developed the prototype for the electronic book reader and a low-cost Braille reader for electronic books as well, which I just found fascinating. But perhaps the most interesting trivia-worthy item is that in 2007, he was awarded the DVD Association DVD Hall of Fame. And I think that probably most kids these days wouldn't even know what a DVD was if you asked them, much less what it would take to get into a DVD Hall of Fame. But nonetheless, for those of us who do remember, that was certainly an important award. So for those playing at home, by the time Dr. McCrary finishes his keynote, I would encourage you to guess how many DC universities that he has been at during his career, and also how many are left that he has not yet been a part of in one way or another. So with that, Dr. McCrary, thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Dr. Jonah, for that very kind introduction. And I also want to thank Dr. Susan Reno for putting this together. And I want to thank all of you all for, who are part of the Advancing Research Impact in Society, or the ARIS group, for this invitation. I very much appreciate the invitation to join this group, and all of you all I consider are national leaders in advancing research impacts. I'm delighted to tell you about the National Science Board's Vision 2030, and I'm really eager to hear from you all when we get to the Q&A, because we see this as a living document, because the priorities will change. But we're hoping that what you will hear today, we'll be able to sit back 10 years from now and say that we've really made a difference, especially on nurturing diverse domestic STEM talent and skills and building a STEM capable workforce and spurring innovation and entrepreneurship. Now when the National Science Board wrote Vision 2030, we had hoped we'd had the opportunity to engage with leaders like you who share our goals and are working on initiatives to achieve them. And I'm eager to hear from you to see opportunities where you see roadblocks. So like I say, whether it's now in our Q&A session or at any time after this, please stay in touch with myself, your colleagues, our board, other board members that you may know, program officers at the National Science Foundation on how we can tweak this vision and make it better. Now, our report provides a vision of where the U.S. science and engineering enterprise, which is essential to our nation's economy and national security, must be in 2030. Let's not forget that the mission of the National Science Foundation has not changed since 1947 with Vannevar Bush, is, fundamental research, economic development, and national security. This vision that I'm going to present today lays out the actions that the National Science Board, or as we finally say, call the NSB, and the National Science Foundation and other national, state, and local organizations can take to achieve the vision so that America remains a global leader in science and engineering. So I'm going to preview and just warn you, the vision is big, it's bold, and it's actionable, and you all play a role. And we hope you do play a role and so choose. So the next slide, please. So the National Science Board, you may not be familiar with, but it is the only board that has a governance role over an agency in the federal government. There are many other boards like the Defense Science Board, the NASA Board, which are advisory boards to the agency, but we actually have a governance role in terms of oversight and budgetary role in terms of NSF. And as you can see here, we do everything from policies to budget. But we also have another role, and that is we advise the president and the Congress. I have meetings constantly with members and staff members on the Hill. We issue reports like the biannual Science and Engineering Indicators Report. Next edition will be out next January 22. And we also issue a lot of reports that talk about workforce, STEM, the state of science and engineering, and you've seen many of these reports. I want to give at this time a big, big shout out to Ellen Ochoa, who is the chair of the National Science Board. Under her leadership for the past year and for the next year, she played a role on the Vision 2030 team, and right now as a chair is really poised and making great progress with all my colleagues on the National Science Board. I have to give them a shout out in making this happen, in making the vision happen. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to the NSBO staff who helps us, particularly who helped us with this presentation today, Dr. Portia Flowers and Nadine Lim. I want to give them a shout out. And then finally, credit, because a lot of what you're going to see today is going to be carried out in sync with the National Science Foundation. So I want to give a big shout out to Director Sethuraman Pachanathan and all of his ADs and his team there, who we have worked hand in hand now as we go forward with this vision. So the next slide, please. So a couple of years ago, about 2017, we had our offsite as a board. We had the vision that had come out from the board in 2005, which was labeled Vision 2020. And so we saw we were coming to the end of that vision. And we said, okay, as we go forward and think about the research landscape for the nation for the next 10 years, what are kind of some of the baseline assumptions going in? And some of those are, one, increasing foreign competition, particularly from places like Russia and China. Two, demographics of our population. If we look at the Census Bureau and what they tell us, in 2045, we're going to be a majority nation. How are we making sure that those future generations are involved in coming up and appreciating the research enterprise that we have developed all these years? Third thing is obviously things like climate change and other challenges that not only affect us as a nation, but affect us globally. So we went around and talked to, over 70 institutions, well over 200 or 300 stakeholders. We went to HBCUs. We went to PWIs. We went to HSIs. We went and talked internally to NSF in terms of their ADs, their program officers. Hey, what do you see in the future? Next slide, please. We talked to academic and scientific, back up just one, please, to scientific societies. We went to the R1s. And so we went to many people who make up the research ecosystem here in America and say, hey, look, where do we need to be 10 years? What do you see out on the horizon? What are the opportunities for us as a nation together? And also, what are some of those barriers that we're going to have to overcome in order to carry out this vision? And what are the key elements? So next slide. So if you look at this, and this is somewhat of an eye slide, but I will talk you through it. We feel that if we come together around this vision, which came out in May of 2020, and if all of us sat back 10 years, we're going 10 years from now and sat back and looked, we would say that we won, we've made the investments that we needed to make in order to be preeminent in science and engineering, our R&D community. I think you're starting to see some of that in some of the bills that are being proposed, coming out with the latest legislation like the EFA. You know, that we are attracting talent from around the world. That also we are operating within scientific principles with certain ethics, and that at science is both a welcoming thing for people of all types coming in. That we are partnering, okay? This is with government, industry, and academia, like we haven't done before. And this is more than just a photo op, okay? This is real partnerships where we are exchanging and saying, focusing on those ideas. That we're delivering the benefits of research, that research is not just something that's seen as ivory tower or something that's seen in the journals of prestigious publications, but is also something that's making a difference for our citizenry. And then finally, that all parts of our populace are involved in our R&D community. I like to think of this as kind of we're at a Sputnik 2 moment, and I can say that because I'm not going to tell you my age, but I was around for Sputnik 1. And I remember how much money, because of the National Defense Education Authorization Act, was poured into the DC public schools. I'm a native of Washington, DC, and went to DC public schools. And we had all the new math. We had teachers who came in with new skills. Of course, this may seem outdated, but we had books that were coming into the classroom, and we were all signed up with library cards, and we had laboratories, so that we were learning all of these things, because at the time we felt the country was behind. At this time was the Soviet Union, and that we were now in the middle of a space race. So next slide, please. And so with that, and this is a build, when I talk about that ecosystem of private industry, and those are small businesses as well as large corporations, government from the city municipal level all the way up to the federal level, and academia, and if not, we're just talking universities, but community colleges and trade schools, because that still technical workforce is extremely important. When I was at Bell Laboratories for 10 years, you know, a large portion of our workforce were people without degrees who had skilled trades who were extremely important as part of the research ecosystem. So assume we now have this conversation between this triad of folks here. Here's 3 key questions. So this is a build. First build, please. So the question that I think of kind of implied, how do we keep our lead in fundamental research? And why is that lead important? Because that's important in terms of our quality of life here in the United States, making those new innovations and being able to go forward, you know, and not only because we're interested in the accumulation of wealth, but also the accumulation of knowledge. Next build, please. How can we take some of these discoveries that come out of the laboratory and lead to the businesses and entrepreneurs? You know, remember when we talked about the space race, we talked about industries like Texas Instruments that came out with handheld calculators, dried foods, these type of things. things that kept our economy vibrant as well as opened the doors to innovation. And then final build, please, is, and how can we increase STEM skills and opportunities for all? Because it's very clear, even when we were Sputnik 1, when we were doing things, we were calling it STEM before STEM. It was very important that we had these skills and that these things reach down were part of our K through 12. I mean, I can tell you during the Sputnik 1 moment, I got interested in chemistry because we had chemistry sets. We were very early on. And that led to a lot of curiosity, as well as working with things in model rockets and working with things in biology with a lot of science. So our next slide is, we've got to look at this, and this is a build. What are the kind of the elements, however, if we're going to have that leadership, or at least to maintain even with global competition? So first build, please. So the first part of that is partnerships, and I've talked about this previously. We can't make this on our own. To make the most of our investments and broader impacts in workforce development, we're going to need to strengthen interagency coordination and add more partnerships with the private sector, philanthropic organizations, state governments, and international partners. Today's summit with ARIS and the Research Impact Canada is a perfect example, of the type of partnerships NSB wants to nurture. Next build, please. People go where the science and engineering opportunities are the greatest, and we're talking about infrastructure. We're not just talking about the big telescopes, but we got to have labs in the schools and in the universities and in our communities. Things like urban gardens, hydroponics, extremely important, because without the data, software, computation, and the networking capabilities, as well as the facilities needed to do science, we won't be competitive. We need to create opportunities to link researchers together through larger networks across the country and a range of institutions. And no more telling, because this came out in May of 2020, the vision, as we can see what's happened with the pandemic. We talked about a digital divide. We didn't think it was that much. But with the pandemic, we see that it really exacerbated in terms of students, for example, may have had computers, but didn't have access to ISPs. Or on a larger scale, we think about our facilities that we have, NSF has, and at Antarctica in McMurdo Station, where right now we have a skeleton crew. Wouldn't it be nice if we had the networking capabilities up to a robust standard, such that we can do experiments remotely without having to go there? We know that building infrastructure is one of the main objectives of ARIS, whether it's developing tools like the Broadening Impacts Review document, or for NSF proposals, or your online resource library, or building international BI communities. ARIS strengthening the broadening impacts infrastructures of this nation, and I want to commend you for that. So NSB is also working to strengthen the BI infrastructure, especially as it pertains to the missing millions. This includes advocating for equitable state and federal investments in minority serving institutions. And I want to thank Dr. Jonah for calling out that, for example, like the University of District of Columbia, we are an emerging research institution. We're one of what I would call the 22 research intensive HBCUs, extremely important. Because we look to enhance the BI criterion, we want to ensure that everyone in the science and engineering enterprise has the opportunity to contribute their talents and bring their unique perspectives to broaden the impact of research to society. By the way, during our NSB quarterly meeting next week on May 19th at 11 a.m., we're hosting an external panel that will highlight the strength of the MSIs. And I hope all of you all will get a chance to participate in that, because it takes way to go as we look in going from discovery to product. We're also going to need to be more strategic about investments that embrace new research tools, modalities, and foster an inclusive and ethical science and engineering enterprise. Next build, please. So then that's talking about the practice of science. We need to be creative about innovating the practice of science and the BI criterion and the perfect leveraging of this tool. We need to normalize the idea that the practice of science, the products of science, and the application of science are just as important as the science itself. And this involves responsible conduct of research. Now it's time to strengthen the B1 criterion to enhance benefits of research for all Americans. And that's where programs like EPSCoR play a big role. And then finally, the final build, talent. And this is something we've been pushing for long, and it's something I feel passionate about. We can have all three of the previous things we've talked about, the elements of leadership, But if we don't have people, we have nothing. It's our greatest resource. To remain competitive, the U.S. must be a STEM talent powerhouse. And to be ready for 2030, the U.S. will need an R&D workforce that pushes the frontiers of knowledge and a much larger STEM-capable U.S. workforce in which many more Americans have the skills to thrive. We must expand domestic talent and attract global talent, and we must do more to retain both groups. We're going to need to accelerate, folks, the STEM workforce development. NSB's Vision 2030 report shows that while the number of people from underrepresented groups in STEM have grown over the last decade, their participation in STEM does not reflect their representation in the U.S. population. For that to happen by 2030, we must double the number of women, double the number of African American, Blacks, and triple the number of Latinos. We need to recognize and acknowledge when and where and in the S&E ecosystem workforce development happens. And when it comes to NSF-funded research, our broader impacts criterion is a critical part of developing the STEM workforce. When PIs develop activities tied to their BI identities, they provide professional development opportunities for their students, creating and broadening career pathways and sectors. And, when I met with some of the ADs, very recently, we kind of said, we have this mission for NSF as fundamental research, economic development, and national security. But also in a vernacular, what we do is create new knowledge and, change the lives of people. And that's kind of what we ought to be about when we start talking about broader impacts. For example, a recent recipient of NSB's Public Service Award devoted his career to developing research and research-related activities to increase participation of persons with disabilities. And if you saw that presentation, and you hope you see that presentation, it's remarkable. From tools to make technology more accessible to curricula for teachers to building a community, this individual created platforms that increase the participation of people with disabilities in computer science. PIs can also create opportunities for people in their community to engage, serving as on-ramps to the STEM-capable workforce. And so, next slide, please. So what I want you to look at this, and when I talk about the missing means, we have a great opportunity, and we've been there before. But as I've said previously, if you look at the number of Latinos and Blacks and women participating, it's not equal to population parity. And when I look at it, I'll give you a sports analogy. We're up against the New York Yankees. I hope I haven't offended any Yankee fans. And we're the Brooklyn Dodgers. And we're not going to win, or at least maintain our lead, if we have 30% of the team on the bench. So we need the Jackie Robinsons and the Wilma Rudolphs to participate so that we can get there. And how do we get there? Next slide, please. Is focusing on this future. And this is where we call this NSB roadmap. And you can see from the top going down, these are the things that are going to be extremely important for us to get there. And that is fostering a global S&E community where NSF plays an important role in America's international collaborations. We need to make sure that America is a reliable partner and is at a table to avoid being technologically surprised. And when we think about that, we think about, for example, rejoining the Paris Accords. I've talked about expanding the geography of innovation, and this involves, for example, EPSCoR and getting out not only to the urban areas, but to the rural areas. Innovation doesn't happen just from Austin to Boston or on the East Coast, but it happens broadly. And we've got to go out there and reach out to those folks. Again, being a Bell Labs product, in the early 30s and 40s, many of the people who came from Bell Labs came from the rural areas, came from the farmlands, and went in and provided a lot of expertise and innovation. The other is delivering benefits from research. Those things are extremely important because if we're going to ask appropriators to fund NSF and other agencies, the populace wants to see those benefits of that research. And I've talked about developing STEM talent for America. I don't think I have to go into that anymore, but that's a key imperative. So the next slide, please. So despite overwhelming feedback from reviewers that taking NSF's merit review training is best or beneficial to them, most reviewers don't take the training. So earlier this year, NSB passed a resolution for NSF to implement policies, such as mandatory training for reviewers to maximize their preparedness and improve the merit review process. NSB also passed a resolution for broader impact experts like yourselves to serve on NSF committee of visitor panels. These panels evaluate and make recommendations about NSF programs and merit review processes, which help strengthen the agency and realize to enhance the BI criteria. And also, part of this we're looking at includes things like bias training to make sure, if we're looking at small schools or MSIs, that we don't come in with a certain lens in terms of how we review their proposals. Next slide, please. So when I talk about developing STEM talent, you can read this. This is something that is right now a big focus of the board. As I said earlier, we're going to have a panel about MSIs. And in February, when we had our meeting, we talked about the impact of the pandemic, particularly on women and other students in terms of research. So when I say, what role can you play? Because many of you are faculty members. Next slide, please. This is some data that was taken from the Oxide Project, which is funded by NSF, to look at the percentage of underrepresented people of color in the top 50 chemistry departments across the nation. This grant was done in accordance with the American Chemical Society. And the bottom line message is, if you look over the past 10 years, the percentage of faculty at all faculty ranks of underrepresented people of color has only gone from 4.6% to 5.2%. And that means we have to do a lot more, because if we think about that pipeline of talent, we've also got to think about those role models. Because if students are going to go in to get for advanced degrees in chemistry in particular, where this project touched, but this is also the same for physics, biology, and other areas, they've got to see role models and people who succeed. Otherwise, they're going to really think that this is not for them. Next slide, please. And that's why I just showed this very fast. These are the research intensive HBCUs. They're not only the ones that are the R2s, but the M2s like UDC, Tuskegee, Alabama A&M. Next slide, please. These are the 15 ABET accredited engineering, HBCU engineering schools, which only comprise 3% of the engineering schools in the nation, but put out 30% of the Black engineers at the undergraduate level. And so as you can see, here's a mixture of both M2 and R2 schools, Carnegie designation. I'd like to get away from Carnegie designation and talk about research intensive schools. And these are the ones you might want to consider partnering with. Next slide, please. So again, kind of winding up, we got to develop talent. We've got to including researchers in the STEM capable workforce at all levels. Those are people from high school all the way up to the bachelor's degree who do not have a bachelor's degree. There's 36 million folks who are part of the STEM capable workforce in a workforce in America of 155 million. 19 million do not have degrees. Those are the skilled technical workforce. But these electricians, healthcare professionals, IT professionals do a lot of work. For example, as electricians right now, today's electrician has to do coding. They have to do Laplace transforms. They have to do circuit design, but they don't need necessarily a bachelor's degree. But they are part of our research ecosystem. So the next slide. Also talking about benefits, NSF's recent Women's and Minority and People with Disabilities report illustrates the landscape for us. While the S&E unemployment rate is lower compared to the general labor force, scientists and engineers with one or more disabilities had an unemployment rate greater than the US labor force unemployment rate. And Black science and engineering doctoral recipients reported higher rates of paying for their graduate education through personal funds, including loans, compared to other racial groups setting up unequitable long-term financial burdens. Broader impacts holds the systemic solution to the systemic roots of the missing millions, and literally millions within the S&E enterprise have been overlooked and denying their ability to compete and contribute. I have to say we have to work on this, folks, because when I came through, if you were going for a PhD in the STEM areas, you didn't have to pay for anything. So when I see students having to pay for that, there's something we have to do about that, as well as I would say go back to the board statement that we put out in July on systemic racism in science and engineering. And how can we change the system? Because it's going to take a systemic approach to take away some of the systemic disadvantages that we've had in order to have broader impacts. So next slide. So many of you are going to say, well, how do we do this? And how do we attract folks? There's just not enough. And the reason I show this slide is because Mike Mullen, colleague of mine, who became a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the first term of the Obama administration, looked around and said, all I see is people who look around like me at the admiral and general level. Where are our diverse leaders? And they came back and said, well, we can't find any. And he said, of course, that's unacceptable. And of course, being in the military is a command and control organization. He said, don't come back to me unless you can. I know they're out there. And so the first cadre included a young brigadier general named Lloyd Austin. Well, eventually, as you know, he is the Secretary of Defense. So I'm asking the same thing for you. This is Uncle Victor here telling you, NSB needs you to help us implement Vision 2030 and make this happen. Next slide, and this is my final slide. Because if we can come together to realize this vision, we can make America a science and engineering enterprise to continue to thrive with our economic and national security. And more Americans now than ever will have the opportunity to contribute and benefit from our nation's leadership in discovery, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm open to take open some questions now. So do we have any questions in the chat room? Okay, I see one. That talks about NSF passed a resolution to put broader impact professionals on NSF's COVs going forward. Okay, and those are the opportunities. Can you talk about that? Yes, I would be happy to talk about that. I think now proposals that are coming forward when we talk about broader impacts, we have to talk about expanding in terms of what are the impacts in terms of expanding the workforce. As you know now, more students, particularly students at the graduate level getting PhDs, are not actually going into academia, but they're going in other parts. They're going into business, they're going into nonprofits. But how also does our proposals that we put forward, that you put forward, have the impacts of developing that workforce, and particularly even down, not only at the high school level, but the middle school level? How are we showing people how science makes a difference in their life? So that's one thing in broad impacts. The other is how are we communicating these impacts to our leaders? How are we showing them that we're making a difference? And how are we engaged with our research efforts to talk about those broader impacts? And so, for example, some of the things that we're doing at the University of the District of Columbia with our work with the USDA and others is urban gardens. But we're also looking at broader impacts in terms of teaching people how to be sustainable. Because if you think about it right now, in the population across the United States and around the world, 50% of the population lives in urban environments. How do we make sure that we have urban sustainability and resiliency? So those are some of the things that we're looking at from the NSB, because I think where we're moving to is we don't want to measure our impacts from inputs. It's not how many programs we've created or how much money that NSB/NSF has spent on programs, but what are the outputs? What are the number of jobs that are created? What are the number of businesses that are created? What are the number of students who go on in STEM-based careers? How have we changed communities? And community is an important thing. So those are the things that we're now looking at as a board. I'm ready for any other questions. Okay. I see one that says, I would like to hear more about the reviewer training. How will that be delivered? Good question. As you know, across the different directorates, many of them do it differently. But I do know all of them are looking at, in doing the reviewer training, talking about broader impacts. For example, what are examples of broader impacts? Um, and so that discussion is ongoing now. They're also looking at, in terms of broader impacts, how does that look in terms of partnerships? For example, many of the smaller schools and the HSIs and MSIs, how do we bring them into the fold? How are we making sure students are exposed to this type of research? And so they are now in the process for the different directorates to look at broader impacts and defining that criteria. So stay tuned. Dr. McCrary, the NSF for the Future Act of 2021 includes significant funding for an expansion of NSF. Can you talk about the role of broader impacts in that expansion? So I think what you're referring to is the Endless Frontier Act, or some people call that the Schumer Bill. It's been around for a year. I believe tomorrow it actually will be out on the Senate floor. And what it talks about is putting a technology directorate and expanding NSF to almost doubling, maybe possibly tripling its budget. This technology directorate would be responsible for taking some of the research that comes out of the other directorates and then working together to how do we get that technology out to industry or out to societal needs. And so that's where you're going to start seeing a lot of things with broader impacts. If this were to happen and it were to pass, and I'm sure there's still going to be a lot of put and takes back and forth between the House and the Senate as this goes forth, and there's been lots of discussions beforehand, we'll be looking at issues of things like STTRs, SBIRs would be part of this directorate. You can imagine NSF I-Corps being part of this directorate. How do we look at customer discovery? Because that's a broader impact too. And so I would say stay tuned for that, because with that, there is a corresponding House bill, and you'll see how those two will work together. The other question that's just come in the chat was, does NSB have recommendations for equitable research collaborations between R1 and HBCUs and MSI R2 research institutions? I would say NSB doesn't have any direct recommendations that you can look at, but I would say tune in next week where we will have that panel on the 19th. We will have a representative from a tribal university, from an Hispanic Serving Institution, and from an HBCU. And they're going to talk about kind of the secret sauce of how they do it with their students. If you look at the report that came out of the National Academies of Science and Engineering Medicine in 2019, where they talked about MSIs, America's a asset for America's STEM workforce. At the undergraduate level, MSIs graduate more STEM graduates than PWIs. I think if you tune in, you'll see opportunities to partner, as well as I am more than willing to come, as I have in the past 3 months since we have gone out with the vision, to talk to your institution and talk to your university leaders and your faculty about how to build partnerships with HBCUs and other MSIs. We have another question that says, what do you feel is the single most important thing every research university in the United States can do to support the NSB vision? Wow. I think, first of all, to support the vision, I would ask you to invite the NSB and its members to come out to talk about the vision. Because what's good for the University of Missouri and how they impact their community may be different than how Georgia Tech impacts their community, or how Caltech impacts their community, or how the University of the District of Columbia impacts their community. I would say the most important thing right now with the vision is to be engaged and see how you can implement those 4 elements, particularly the element of talent, because that's extremely important. How do we get more talent coming in? How do we particularly go after that diverse domestic talent? How do we create environments and looking at that? And then as universities, if you think about the land grant institutions, why were they founded? They were founded to make a difference in those communities, to help at that time farmers and later folks who were in the mechanical arts, to take some of that research and go out and be able to help their communities. And I think if we can do that, we can say, look, how can we help our fellow woman and fellow man out there to make life better through the research and knowledge we generate? That will be the biggest thing that will help empower the vision and help us keep our lead. Given the role of science and engineering in international affairs, can Vision 2030 contribute to global science and prosperity, and in what ways? I think one ways we can do that, and you've seen that, is engaging our partners on some of the global issues that face us. It's not only things like climate change, but for example, water resources, food security. These are important things. The pandemic is extremely important, and how we engage folks. And also at the same time, how do we make sure that when we do engage folks, that there's a free share of information across, and we're making sure that with our partners, we're not giving away intellectual property. So I think we can engage those. I was so glad to see the administration work and rejoin the Paris Accords, and things like working with NSF's Office of Polar Programs is extremely important. 2 minutes left. So what responsibility do universities have to support and advance the broader impacts efforts of their faculty? Well, particularly if you're a public university, I think you have a great responsibility, because that's why public universities were founded, to help the overall public. And so I think every time we do something, every student we educate, how are we impacting our community and how we're making that better? And so I think in a broader sense, that's what we should do. But I would be more than happy and send your invitation in to Dr. Flowers or myself directly to come and talk to your leaders about how you specifically in your community can do that. And I think says Jonah, Dr. Jonah, we're going to have to wrap this up soon. So I see this thing, one final question. The federal government provides substantial support to universities. What guidelines do you offer to senior leadership? All I will say is this is a very progressive board we have, and I could imagine that the board will work with NSF to say, hey, look, we're going to have to see more evidence of what you're doing in terms of broader impacts and broader participation, from what do your faculty ranks look like in terms of the students you graduate, in terms of how we look at that as part of our merit review criteria.
Great. Well, with that, we're out of time. Dr. McCrary, thank you so much for your remarks and for joining us today. I know it's always a challenge when we can't see the audience in front of us, and there are many here who I know share my gratitude to you for your remarks today and for inspiring all of us in the work that we do as a broader impacts community, often unheralded, but I think, as your remarks point out, more needed and more important today than ever in terms of the investments the government is making in our institutions and in our researchers to give back and to show the taxpayers why it matters and the kind of benefits that accrue to the communities and to society at large. And you yourself have been a great example of those translational benefits from the research into technological innovation, DVDs notwithstanding. So with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you again so much, and for everybody else, enjoy the rest of today's agenda.
Thank you very much.